He knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Yes, everyone, the wait is finally over. This is the video that I've been building up to for the entire Supervillains Explored Superman Marathon. And this is the video that everybody has been patiently waiting for. And now I reward you all for your patience. Today, we take a look at what is undoubtedly one of the most highly revered and popular antagonists within the entire history of comic books. And that character is none other than Darkseid. Darkseid is unquestionably one of the most popular and most famous villains to be created by the king of comics himself, Jack Kirby, alongside characters like Dr. Doom and Galactus. Darkseid is the omnipotent, tyrannical king of the planet Apocalypse and the master of the Omega Force. And despite the fact that just about anybody who knows even a little bit about comic books is more than likely going to know who Darkseid is, very few people actually know Darkseid's true origin story about where he came from and how he became the way he was. And that is what I plan to do with this very video. So sit back, relax, grab a snack, and enjoy the video, because this is going to be good. Now, Darkseid's very first appearance was in Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen number 134 in 1970. Now, simply due to that fact alone, I'll bet most of you actually want to laugh. Because the mere idea of Darkseid actually first appearing in a Jimmy Olsen book sounds completely absurd. But believe it or not, it's actually a lot cooler than it sounds, because when Kirby was given reign over a number of DC titles, he used these books to introduce his new pantheon of cosmic superhero characters, which were the New Gods. He used the Jimmy Olsen books to introduce the Forever People, and was eventually given control of his own series of books based on the Fourth World and even Etrigan. But I'll just spare all of the historic comic specific details and actually just get into Darkseid's actual origin story itself, not quoting any single specific comic or publication date. Darkseid's real name is Uxas, and he was a prince of Apocalypse and the son of Yuga Khan and Hegra. Yuga Khan was a powerful warlord and Hegra was a powerful witch. And when Uxas was very young, Yuga Khan was consumed by the Source Wall, leaving Hegra a widow to raise both Uxas and his brother Drax, who would later become Infinity Man. Now, Drax was next in line to become the king of Apocalypse, which Uxas was highly jealous of him for, and so he plotted since his childhood to overpower both his brother and his mother to become the true ruler of Apocalypse. And one of his efforts to become more influential happened when Uxas traveled to the planet of New Genesis, and there he met a young boy who he wanted to recruit to aid him as his advisor. And to do this, Euxis had followed the boy home, and he released his pet bird, and he lied to the boy, telling the boy that his pet cat had eaten the bird. So the boy avenged his bird by murdering his cat by burying it alive. But when the bird came back to the boy, overtaken with grief at the thought that he had just murdered his own cat for nothing, completely lost his temper and he strangled his pet bird. And this boy would later become Darkseid, and he would pledge his loyalty to Euxis. However, the time came whenever Euxis would finally become Darkseid, was that Drax was finally at the time of his destiny to become the new ruler of Apocalypse. When he gained a psychic connection with the Omega Realm, and to become the scion of the realm by becoming the master of the Omega Force, which is the force that allows you to shoot the Omega beams out of your eyes, which then teleports people into the Omega Realm. At least that's what I remember reading. I may be wrong about that. Anyways, Darkseid had intercepted these powers over Drax, and he supposedly murdered Drax while in the process. And so when Euxis finally inherited these powers and the Omega Force itself, he changed his name to Darkseid. And believe it or not, when this happened, his mother Hegra was actually pretty impressed with him, because Hegra would then reveal to Darkseid that he never even liked Drax. Darkseid's next step for ultimate power came when he decided to hunt the new gods of New Genesis for sport and to eliminate possible rivals that would oppose him. So Darkseid convinced his uncle, General Steppenwolf, also known as the brother of Hegra, to proceed on a sort of a witch hunt for any new gods that they came across, and in their hunt, they came across the wife of Isaiah, aka Highfather, and killed her. And in his anger, Highfather managed to kill Steppenwolf in retaliation, but that didn't prove to be much of a problem for Darkseid, since he managed to resurrect Steppenwolf. But these events sparked a huge galactic war between New Genesis and Apocalypse that would rage on for eons. Darkseid's mother, Hegra, would arrange for him to marry a woman named Tigra. But in truth, Darkseid had no real interest in Tigra, but he had all the interest in a sorceress named Suli. And Suli was actually a very good-natured woman, because she believed that violence and war was wrong, and that people of great power should use their powers to help the weak and oppressed. And Darkseid really genuinely fell in love with Suli, and he actually ended up marrying her, much to Hegra's disapproval. And since Hegra didn't like Suli, she made Darkseid poison and assassinate her in her sleep. And Darkseid, devastated with Suli's death, before Suli died, she actually bore Darkseid a son, which was Kalibak. But Darkseid was arranged to marry a woman named Kariv. But that wedding was interrupted when Doomsday had actually invaded the planet that the wedding was taking place on. But eventually Darkseid, much to his disapproval, would end up marrying Tigra, who would bear him a son, which was Orion. Eventually Darkseid would actually learn the truth of Hegra and Darkseid's plot to murder Suli. And when Darkseid found this out, he offered an ultimatum to Darkseid, that he would help Darkseid murder his own mother, or he would die by Darkseid's hands. And of course, Darkseid, being a coward, accepted Darkseid's offer, even though the two of them would grow very, very emotionally distant, and they would pretty much never become the friends that they originally were. But Darkseid would actually meet a soldier called Goodness, who would have a battle with another creature named Mercy, and she would win against this creature Mercy, and Darkseid would appoint Goodness to be the head of the Apocalypse orphanages, to where she would train the orphans to be Darkseid soldiers, and the most powerful of these orphans would be the female Furies, who would serve to be Darkseid's personal honor guard. At some point during the war with New Genesis, Darkseid would encounter the Green Martians, and he learned of their whole philosophy. Their philosophy came from something called a life equation, which represented the quality of will and consciousness and freedom. When Darkseid learned of this, he figured that this life equation was some sort of cosmic force, not too dissimilar to that of the Omega Force. And so he figured that there must be an opposite to the life equation, which he theorized to be called the anti-life equation. So Darkseid's lifelong obsession would be gaining possession of the anti-life equation in order to subjugate the entire universe. And pretty much at some point during the war, Darkseid and Highfather would come to a truce. They would both have to trade each other's firstborn sons in order to sort of initiate a ceasefire between the two worlds. And so it happened. Highfather would trade his son Scott free to Apocalypse, while Darkseid would trade his son Orion. However, this little truce ended up probably being the worst thing that ever happened to Darkseid, because Scott Free would eventually escape the Apocalypse orphanages and ghettos, and he would fall in love with the leader of the female Furies, Big Barda, and the two of them would, of course, go on to become Mr. Miracle and Big Barda, and they would become two highly powerful cosmic superheroes that would oppose Apocalypse. And on top of that, his son Orion would probably become the most fearsome and mighty warrior of the entire fourth world, and so a prophecy was created that one day Darkseid would die by Orion's hands. So that's pretty much Darkseid's origin in a nutshell, and I've barely scratched the surface of his exploits. Darkseid and Superman's paths would cross whenever Darkseid would eventually learn of Earth. Having learned that all the human population on Earth were pretty much individuals, all capable of their own free thinking, Darkseid believed that he would have to gain numerous samples from countless human populations on Earth in order to find the answer to the anti-life equation, believing that all of the free-thinking consciousness and wills of the entire human population would piece together the anti-life equation. So Darkseid would try to invade Earth and kidnap a lot of humans, about a good half of the entire human population, which of course led him into conflict with Superman, and the two became very, very, very hated enemies. In fact, I think it's pretty accurate to say that Superman has a lot more hatred and animosity towards Darkseid than just about any other villain imaginable. And a couple of the things that Darkseid had done is that I remember reading one thing where Darkseid actually tried to overthrow the Olympian gods in order to gain their power, to become more omnipotent and godlike. And so when he did this, when he requested the help of the Amazons on Themyscira, and they refused, he ended up laying waste to about half of their population. Only for Wonder Woman to end up defeating Darkseid by sanctioning a part of her soul into him, suppressing all of his barbaric, evil, warlike instincts. Despite Darkseid's evil nature, he has actually helped the superheroes in a couple of instances. One was during the Crisis on Infinite Earths event, where Darkseid actually helped all the heroes of the different alternate dimensions to battle against the Anti-Monitor. And the second instance during the Our Worlds at War event, where Imperiex Prime literally threatened all life in the universe. And Darkseid, alongside Mongol, had to literally collaborate with all the heroes and villains in order to defeat Imperiex once and for all. Darkseid would actually meet his end in the storyline titled Death of the New Gods. During this point, the fourth world was sort of reaching its apocalypse, while some mysterious entity or character was murdering various new gods across the universe. Darkseid decided to use all these deaths to his advantage to try to plot an overthrow of not only the fourth world, but of Earth itself. He used various pawns from the female Jean Loring version of Eclipso to marry Marvel. Yeah, that's right. Billy Batson's own sister became a thrall of Darkseid. But Darkseid had also been using the war between the race of the Monitors and when Captain Atom became the entity known as Monarch, as sort of a distraction to hide his plans for the entire universe, because he sought to initiate a new age called the Fifth World, sort of attempting to recreate the apocalyptic events that led to the creation of the Fourth World, with all the great wars and the worlds being split in two and all of that. But after a whole bunch of contrived and really retarded plot twists and battles, Darkseid would find a boom tube in Metropolis that would open up a portal to which his son Orion would actually come out of. Darkseid and Orion would battle, and Orion would fulfill the prophecy by ripping out Darkseid's heart out of his chest and then killing him. During the event known as Final Crisis, Darkseid and a large number of his followers would be reincarnated as a human mafia gang residing in Bloodhaven, who ran a nightclub called the Darkseid Club, where a Metropolis detective called Dan Turpin would investigate, seeing how the Darkseid Club sort of had a connection to the disappearance of a large number of metahuman children. However, Darkseid, in his boss Darkseid form, revealed that he finally somehow managed to get a hold of the anti-life equation and was using it to bend all these metahuman children to his will. Over the next few weeks, Darkseid would use his servant on Earth, Libra, to arrange and create a new secret society of supervillains and launch a very highly coordinated attack on the Daily Planet and lay waste to the ranks of the Justice League, killing John Jones, the Martian Manhunter, framing Hal Jordan for the killing of Orion, infecting Wonder Woman with some kind of disease, not to mention actually kidnapping Batman. Also, Darkseid managed to actually gain possession of Dan Turpin's body. And after this event, Darkseid sort of managed to stream the anti-life equation all over the internet, and anybody who managed to come across it while looking on their computers would be subjugated to Darkseid's mind control and would even spread it all across the world. But when Barry Allen came back due to some type of weird, unexplained instance, he attempted to stop Darkseid, but at this point Darkseid's very presence and essence became so corrupt and so powerful and unstable that he was corrupting the very multiverse itself. And a whole bunch of highly confusing events. Somehow both Darkseid and Barry Allen were warping continuity and time and reality all across Earth. And while Batman was imprisoned by Darkseid, he managed to escape his cell and confronted Darkseid in his throne room. Darkseid offered Batman an ultimatum to embrace his new world and his new paradise, which Batman, of course, would refuse. And so, Batman somehow gained a possession of the Radion gun and bullet that Darkseid himself used to kill his son, Orion. And of course, this was probably the one instance where Batman had broken his number one impregnable rule of never using a gun. And so Batman fired the bullet at Darkseid's head, while at the same time Darkseid fired his Omega Beam at Batman. And while Darkseid was pretty badly wounded from the bullet, he did not die, unlike Batman, who was apparently killed off by the Omega Beams. Again, supposedly, because we all know that Bruce Wayne would come back during the Return of Bruce Wayne story arc, where he was, traveling through time and all of that. So Superman finds out about this, and he is pissed. So Superman finally confronted Darkseid and sort of fought him as a distraction for Barry Allen, Black Racer, and Wonder Woman to undermine Darkseid and try to stop him due to his weakening condition due to the radion poisoning from Batman's shot. So Superman would construct the device called a Miracle Machine, which is regularly used by the Legion of Superheroes to try to turn thoughts into reality. And Superman used this to try to undo the influence of the anti-life equation over Earth's population. But Darkseid would try to attempt to corrupt this device as well with his very essence, to which Superman would realize that Darkseid's very presence and being resonated with that of the entire multiverse, and that somehow his physical form became really sensitive to like supersonic high-pitched noise. So Superman literally sings at Darkseid, and that manages to destroy him. Yeah. I may have gotten a lot of this wrong, but all I did was just simply look this up, and that's kind of a pretty shitty way for a villain like Darkseid to go out. But yeah. But Darkseid may be redeemed in the New 52, since, he's pretty much the villain that the Justice League is going up against first. And that's Darkseid for you. This video was pretty difficult to do, and there have been a lot of people who have talked about Darkseid, and I mean a lot of people. But one thing I tried to do here is that I tried to explain Darkseid's origin and maybe try to lay down a little bit of his motivations as to why he is the way he is. And try to explain his antagonism with Superman. The thing about Darkseid, and the thing that makes him such a compelling villain, especially for Superman, is that Darkseid is of the belief that he is a super powerful, nearly invincible, godlike being who believes that he should use his powers to dominate and subjugate the entire population of beings and creatures who are far beneath him. And that's the big dichotomy between Darkseid and Superman, is that Darkseid believes in ruling over the weaker life forms and making them serve him, whereas Superman is all about considering himself an equal, despite the fact that he is nearly all-powerful like Darkseid is. So, that, those two differences between these characters make them perfect arch-enemies, in my opinion, because they're both nearly godlike alien beings, but one of which chooses to give in to his desires and urges to rule over all the people who are far less stronger than he is, and the other chooses to be a savior and to be a modest helper to the people that are far less fortunate and way less powerful than he is. So that's what makes Darkseid such a disgusting and truly evil and malevolent villain. And so for that reason, I think Darkseid is an amazing bad guy. And despite me first being exposed to Darkseid through the 90s animated series, which was in itself a great portrayal, because Michael Ironside, I can't imagine anybody else voicing Darkseid, I've come to enjoy him in all the comics that I've read. And he's truly one of the greatest creations by the king of comics himself, Jack Kirby, along with all the rest of the Fourth World franchise and its characters. So yeah, that's all I gotta say, folks. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope it was worth the wait, and later.